another episode of Unlocking California Politics. My name is Sanjay. I'm the Senior Vice President of Government Affairs for the California Association of Realtors, and today we are joined by Assemblymember Sharon Quirk-Silva, who was elected to the Assembly for the first time in 2012 and returned in 2018. She represents North Orange County and parts of Los Angeles County. Before serving in the state legislature, she was a member of the Fullerton City Council, which included 2 terms as mayor. She's a lifelong resident of Fullerton and a former teacher in the Fullerton School District. Assemblymember Quirk-Silva chairs the Budget Subcommittee on State Administration and is chair of the Orange County Homelessness and Mental Health Services Select Committee, among other committees. A very, very full resume. Assemblymember Quirk-Silva, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Thank you. In your time in the Assembly, you've been an advocate for many important issues, including housing, mental health issues, and veterans affairs. Can you share some of the initiatives, especially as pertaining to housing, that you have supported or believe have been especially important to you over the years?
California is a very large state with diverse population, with individuals of all incomes. And the one issue that comes up regularly through polling and what we see in our communities is housing. And that question is not only coming from graduates. I live in Orange County, where we have Cal State Fullerton, one of the largest Cal States with thousands of students graduating. And the question being asked is, how do they live and work in Orange County?
Right.
And housing continues to be an issue for, of course, our lowest wage earners and homeless individuals. So you can't go too far without talking about housing in California.
So, as a member of the Budget Subcommittee and other housing committees this year, what are some of the overarching challenges that you see specifically with, let's start with just increasing the supply of affordable housing?
Well, over the last handful of years, I've served on the Housing Committee, where, of course, we are talking about how many units in California are being built. We know we are falling far, far short of the numbers that were being projected that we need. That being said, there have been some little glimmers of hope with ADUs being built, more permits being pulled across the state. And we know that more and more single-family homeowners are using that as an option, whether it's a mother-in-law, as we used to call them, mother-in-law units, or a young adult individual or family. So that has been a little spark of hope there. But we know that at the local government level, our city councils, we have to get to yes faster and a streamlined way. And that's not happening from jurisdiction to jurisdiction in the capacity that we need it with the urgency we need.
You mentioned ADU, which have really been one of the, I would say, hesitate to say few, but one of the real success stories. That's a better way to put it. It's one of the real successes we've had in California with helping address our housing situation. Have you found most of the cities within your district, at least at this point, fairly receptive to ADUs?
They have become more and more. Since I sat on as I said, the Housing Committee, we have seen many, many pieces of legislation to address this in the last really 5-6 years. And that has, of course, increased the permits, but everything from how costly a permit is to shelf-ready plans has really encouraged some of these individuals to pursue this. I know even myself, I have looked into it for my own house, and there's all types of models out there. So I think there's a little bit of something for everybody if you're in the position to want to do that. I know one of the focus areas has been access to capital, and that is something that we continue to try to look towards as far as future legislation, possibly giving incentives. Although the state did put forward a pretty large sum for $40,000 grants for individuals to build ADUs, and those were snapped up very quickly.
Right. And it's interesting you mentioned the sort of ready-made plans and all these other sort of market responses to the ability to build ADUs. Whenever I do research for something connected to a bill or policy, and then I go on Facebook or something like that, I'm almost every other ad that pops up is, so you're interested in building an ADU? The financing is available, so which is a good thing. Um, so you're a former educator, as we mentioned in your biography. So you have a unique perspective on how housing stability can affect education. Can you talk about that connection a bit between housing, educational outcomes, and that relationship?
Housing stability is essential as far as students thriving academically. It's very simple. If a student is moving from house to house, apartment to apartment, or even experiencing homelessness, you are going to see a drop in their academic um, ability. We know that as a classroom teacher, I used to focus solely on reading, writing, and math, teaching elementary. And then as I taught more years and we experienced the real decline in 2008, it really became important to me to find out what was the housing situation for my students. Because again, if they were couch surfing or sharing a very small unit with many,
Hmm.
many people, these are all the impacts that we know we'll see in the classroom. So that was really some of the very basis for when I came to Sacramento, some of the work I wanted to do.
Yeah, I mean that's something which our own surveys and studies show, and especially from our perspective, the best way to reduce insecurity would be more home ownership opportunities because that creates the real stable communities that way as well. You've also advocated, but through legislation and sponsored legislation and authored legislation for removing barriers to home ownership in the state. One of those bills is AB 1308. If you could discuss that.
Yeah, that was a bill that was signed a few years back, and it's really to allow families to have a little bit more jurisdiction over their own property. So, for example, if they wanted to add an additional bathroom, if they wanted to build an additional bedroom within the square footage that they have already, that they would not have to add additional parking. And this gives families that flexibility as their own children may grow, move in, move out. Again, I already mentioned mother-in-law, but it really allows families to have that liberty with their own property to make some of the best choices. With the former legislation in place that you would have to build additional parking, it really kept people from having that freedom with their own property.
Yeah, and actually, now that you mention it, that was in a way a very timely bill because it does seem both as a thing as a matter of choice and sometimes necessity, especially post pandemic. It seems we are seeing more people sort of stay at home until they're really ready to move on to buy their own unit or sort of quote unquote settle down. So it makes sense
I
that
think we have a lot of,
yeah,
I want to say millennials, but I'm actually going to have to even say, is it Gen Z?
yeah, I think that's right.
That we used to think they would go off to college
Hmm.
and then move out, and that would be kind of the process. But we've definitely seen in the last handful of years, particularly the pandemic, where that's
Right.
really not an option. And allowing young adults to stay at home longer, save money
Hmm.
for these down payments is definitely, I think, a pattern we're seeing.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, you mentioned earlier that there's been sometimes resistance within um, certain cities to, previously ADUs and other forms of increasing home ownership, typically referred to as NIMBYism, not in my backyard. How do you think you can address that? And I'll break that into two questions. First, with respect to the cities themselves, and then the second part we can talk about how maybe just among the people themselves, because I think I can speak for even our realtor membership. There were some overall, we've obviously supported more supply and increasing homeownership opportunities and as you mentioned, the ability for people to do with their own properties a little more. But even within some of our own membership, there used to be resistance to ADUs. Like, what are you doing, allowing all these little? And now everybody's like, oh, that's a no-brainer. Of course, you that the ADUs are the best thing ever. How would nobody would oppose those? So once it actually happened, or you think, "Oh, that was actually a pretty good idea," even those people who had been naysayers. So on the first part, what do you think can be done to help encourage or compel or carrot or
Mhm.
stick, cities to keep building more housing?
Well, first, I think the cities need to be in the process of educating their citizens of what are these projects going to look like? What are the impacts? Because with building comes fear, and
Mhm,
that fear is always the worst case scenario. So whether it's going to be parking, whether it's going to be traffic, whether it's going to be more people in a smaller space, is a lot of fear
mhm,
and people that usually come. And I sat on city council for 8 years in Fullerton that come and are opposed to development per se. Sometimes it doesn't matter what development is or what
mhm,
size, they just are against it because they don't want to see the change. They're afraid of all of, as I said, traffic, parking, noise, any of these issues. So, having these listening sessions or these community sessions that would engage them, and you thought it was going to be like this, but we're really going to do more setbacks, or we're actually going to have some open space here, really showing them what the development would look like, I think can really make a difference. But also, I think some of the changes happening internally because, again, as individuals are seeing that they're young adults, their
mhm.
choice is going to be I can't afford to live here, so I'm going to move to another state. And I think there are some individuals are saying, I want them to be here. So they're more likely to be less aggressive against a development or an ADU, as you say. But I think there's multiple things that you can do. And again, it's working with elected leaders because it's the five council members that alter the state has a huge
Mhm,
role in encouraging, enforcing, compelling, but it's ultimately the five council or seven council members,
mhm.
depending on the city, that make those decisions and working with them within your organization to really let them know. A lot of times they just are voting project by project, but they're not looking at across the state. What are the numbers? What are the units? What does this mean to
Mhm.
the economy when we have more people who've graduated from, in my area, Cal State Fullerton, UCI, and that we can retain them here to
Right.
live and work in our community. So I think it's really starting earlier, especially with newly electeds, but also with people who have been on councils for a long time to try to encourage that change of perception that housing is a very good thing for our communities.
Yeah, that I think that that does sum it up. A lot of it's interesting you mentioned, showing the plans, showing what it would look like something which our association has done in the past as a voluntary thing at some of our business meetings was to have affordable housing tours. Like we would just take people and say, these are what some of the beautiful projects that are being developed. People are like, oh, these are pretty good, and it sort of helped open people's minds up.
Because there's definitely a very negative impression of some of the past very, very dense affordable
Correct.
housing. We can say, well, look what was built there, and now this is
Hmm.
what it looks like. And yet, we're not really building that type of housing that was built 20, 30, 40
Right.
years ago. So I think they really need an updated perspective.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and that's something we've noticed is quite successful. Um, One of the big problems we have is, of course, the cost of housing, and I think the areas you represent, some of them used to be middle class areas or affordable to the middle class. They might still be in terms of income, but some the individuals, but the homes themselves are certainly now all expensive. What do you think can do to help bring down some of those costs or make the areas more affordable to middle income and below?
Well, I think we used to think of housing as if you want to say your first starter home being a single
Hmm.
family, and that might have come with the three bedrooms, maybe one bath, and a little backyard front yard. But I think we need to reimagine housing for the future. And what does that look like? It may be very much a smaller, going actually back to the 1920s, where those first homes were two bedrooms,
Hmm.
one bath, and then what are the amenities? Because I know that what we used to think as the American dream or the California dream, the backyard, the front
Hmm.
yard, there's many younger generation that don't want that responsibility of
Right.
caring for a yard, but they do like the idea of a pool or a gym or a dog park, very
Hmm.
big dog park, that kind of little open space. So really looking at what are some housing, if you want to say single or first time home ownership, that might be on a smaller, compacted type of vision, that the price point is still somewhat affordable, because we know housing has become incredibly
Right.
unaffordable. But is there something within the 400, 500 range that might be much smaller, but offer that first step into home ownership, some in a way like a condo would have in
Right.
the past?
Right. So kind of rethinking maybe that you don't need that as a starter home. But and as you mentioned, we're in the Sacramento area. Some of the older neighborhoods, you see the homes, they're very small, and it's people forget that that used to be a home for a family once upon a time, and now people.
And I think also for the younger generation, and I'm not sure if we're there yet, but I do know there is, and I see it through social media, some efforts of really starting to look at minimalism, in the sense of, do I need all of the very large vehicles? Do I need
Right.
all of, extra large sofas? Do I need, and can I do well within a one bedroom, two bedroom? Because I think we kind of supersized housing along with our meals and everything else. And I know now it's like, what is a regular kind of smaller first time homeowner experience, or what could that be?
Right. Do you think that last week's executive order by Governor Newsom will be of assistance to helping get the needed housing moving?
That is a very complex decision, obviously made by the Supreme Court, giving the permission to say that we
Right.
are actually going to be starting to clear encampments and force people indoors, which I don't disagree with, because we know the longer people are outdoors or chronically homeless, they're simply going to die on the streets. It's also not sanitary. It's not good for businesses or schools, and it's not good for them
Hmm.
to be out. But the big question is, all right, if we're going to implement this, where are people going?
Right.
So without the units of array of sizes or at cost points, and without building those in a very quick and urgent fashion, we're still kind of stuck with the same scenario, which is you
Right.
can go to an encampment, and here we are in Sacramento down the street, and say you
Mhm.
can't be there. Uh, but where is this person going to go?
Right.
So we have a long ways to go to find those solutions. Now we passed Proposition 1,
Correct.
very not a lot of enthusiasm in some areas for it, but it did indeed pass. We had a hearing today that really talks about 30% of the mental health, the MHS Act,
Mhm.
needs to be used for housing production. So I know the governor is very fond of his home key model, so they're
Correct.
calling it Home Key Plus,
Mhm.
and that would be again to readapt former motels, hotels
Correct.
for bridge housing. So I think in the future there are some solutions and funding behind it, but I still have a very big concern about how long it's going to take to build these, adapt these, how long it's going to take, because it isn't just the housing, it's also the services that need to come along with that, related to mental health and all of that. But we're taking steps.
Yeah. And that's a big part of it. Is just I think people want to see that at least there's movement, because I think that's one of the been the a lot of skepticism, as you mentioned, that Proposition One it passed, but kind of barely.
Right.
Um, and I remember talking about this with somebody who's not involved in government and saying, I think if people believed for sure that what it says is going to happen, it would have passed overwhelmingly. People are just skeptical.
I think one of the points on that is because if you look at the homeless numbers across California, they're the highest in the nation. We have one of the largest
Hmm.
states in the nation. But that being said, it doesn't appear that anything's really getting solved. And that's twofold. One is that there are people being removed from the streets and actually getting into permanent supportive
Hmm.
housing. But if you move 10 out and then you have 13 following, it looks like the same group.
Right.
So they're not
That's
necessarily the
true.
same people, but there are some people getting support. The second part of that is that as you do that, we haven't focused enough as a state on prevention, which means keeping them people that are housed in their, whether it's a rental, whether it's house, stopping some of the evictions where you can get support, and also some rent support. Because we know once somebody is evicted, as you all know,
Hmm.
it's very difficult to find that next unit, if not impossible. And we know that we want protection, of course, for our landlords or homeowners that are
Hmm.
renting, but we also don't want to see people fall into homelessness because it is a very dark hole that
Right.
is very difficult to get out of.
You've also worked on legislation, and this is somewhat related, or uh, meaning to mental health issues on veterans' mental health specifically. Can you talk about how mental health issues intersect with housing issues for veterans?
Yes, and again, in our hearing today, that came up because with Proposition 1, there will be $1 billion
Hmm.
for additional housing for veterans because, again, we know we do have some veterans campuses across the state, but we certainly don't have enough for the veterans that we see that are not only aging, but many of them have some mental health issues. So having this set aside fund to build new veteran housing, $1 billion worth, I think will make a difference. But the second part of that is again, what we have seen is veterans get many benefits
Hmm.
once they've done their service, which they should. But because many of them who sign up, sometimes at 18 years old,
Hmm.
this is their first time living away, they're in a very structured environment. And when you're in the military, pretty much your entire day and life is mapped out for you. And then when they leave, they do have orientations upon departure, but many times they want to get home, they want to kind of get back into life. And that's where some of the pieces fall apart,
Oh,
which
interesting.
is they're not tapping into their health benefits, their mental health benefits. And certainly, there are people who actually prey on our veterans for some of the benefits they get. So, really making sure they kind of have a team around them to make sure, again, that they're not falling into homelessness, or if they have mental health issues, that they can get that team to support them, not only for mental health, but housing.
Oh, that's interesting. I hadn't thought previously about the shift from the structured environment to kind of the
Mhm.
back to regular life. That's interesting. So for next year, what are some of your legislative priorities?
Well, as I end my 10th year as a legislator, which is a decade now, I feel like I've seen a lot. I feel like we have done a lot. And in some ways, I feel like we need to slim down. Believe it or not, I was here when we went from 25 bills a legislator could do to 50.
Hmm.
And I remember being somebody's like, who would put 50 bills forward in a 2 year term? But we definitely have a lot of bills. So we are going to have to really get a handle on that. Of course, in this budget
Right.
deficit year, quite a lot of bills that are going to appropriations won't get out.
Correct.
As a budget sub chair 5, we were trying to hold on to some important housing programs that we know our local jurisdictions told us that really made a difference. The HAP program, the tax credit programs, so we can continue this building of permanent supportive housing. So I'll continue to work in that space. I have a few things that I'm really interested in, our state parks, just personally. And I think that the more we can get some of our youth engaged, whether it is in hiking or getting to our beaches or even on their own campuses, sports, that makes the big difference from some of this pipeline into prison. So I'll continue working on those type of issues, but housing, production, and pushing that to not us just saying we're doing it, but seeing the numbers
Right.
is still a number one priority for me.
Yeah, great. We always like to hear that. You did mention just now that you were also on the budget subcommittee. That was probably a very challenging year for that after years of running surpluses, the state. Can you just speak a little about your experience in that kind of environment where you had to be watchful about spending and cuts?
Well, it was
even?
fascinating. So I know that you were all very invested in every topic in California, but the California budget really is fascinating, even in its worst
Right.
when we're in a budget deficit. So I've really enjoyed that chairmanship. And in fact, even with a very difficult budget, I kind of attribute it to my own home budget. There are places to cut, and there's places that we should be analyzing that should be cut. An example being, if there are programs we're just doing to do because we've been doing them, but we don't have the data or the numbers to back it up, then it's not necessarily a good program. That means to
Right.
me that maybe you move out a program and put more money into another program. So listening to advocates, we had our small business association saying, these work programs make a difference. So we were able to restore quite a bit of funding to some of the original January proposals by the governor. But really being in that space where you're looking line by line,
Right.
and my budget sub was budget sub 5, all state administration. So everything from labor to housing to homelessness to taxes to veterans to go biz. It was very expansive in having, here's an example, cannabis.
Right.
Cannabis in California is pretty new, and yet we've had the proposition and estimates on how much money would be generated. What is this going to look? Again, it was a lot of those initial fears, a handful of years into it, we're seeing we're really not generating what we thought we
Right.
would.
Right.
But another part of it was the way the proposition was written. So a certain amount of money has to be used for education, a certain amount of money for enforcement. And that's just one issue that came up. And on the enforcement money, the cannabis officers are saying we need triple the amount of money. On the education funds, they were barely using it.
Oh.
But you can't really change those pots of money till the proposition comes back up. But the governor could pull some of the money out for the budget. So those are just little things that you see. But because of being on that committee, I was able to go out on a cannabis enforcement operation, actually in Fullerton, where I live. And that was really interesting, where they had, with multiple agencies, we went to several little shops. It was Valentine's Day, I remember that. And we're talking at one place over $1 million of product. But remember, this is the black market because it's not legal. So these are things as a state, when we have, again, many local jurisdictions say, nope, we're not going to have it here. And again, I'm not getting on the bandwagon here. I'm just saying, but they don't realize it's there in their city anyhow.
Right.
And they're just not getting taxed on it. So that's all in the black market. And that's where, again, this education has to come in. If they were meeting with these officers and meeting and seeing that you turn around, they close it down and the rack open,
Right.
that's revenue going out the door. So It has been fascinating to be on this budget committee.
Yeah, no, it sounds like it. It sounds like because it's as you mentioned, especially your budget subcommittee touched on, since all the different agencies, all those different areas. That's very
Yeah.
interesting. Um, Also, so now we're gonna switch gears a little and head into the political realm. Um, this has been one of the most interesting political seasons historically, with the historic decision of President Biden not to continue seeking a second term after having effectively won the amount of delegates necessary to seek that second term as a Democrat, and the change with Vice President Kamala Harris, and now the new vice presidential candidate as well, the new candidate for vice president. Um, so a couple of things. So first, how do you see this change impacting voter enthusiasm? Obviously, on the Democratic side, uh, voter enthusiasm for the race.
I think it's huge. I happened to be traveling in London when the word came down that Biden wasn't going to run, and it was
Oh,
very shocking, very
hmm,
surprising. So it has been, again, a very short timeline
right.
to see the enthusiasm just within. I have a large family, so just to see some that were like, Biden is old, we're not voting for him. Even my own uh, 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 young adult kids to enthusiasm. I think that it's really a game changer. I'm biased as a former teacher, so the new vice president, who was a teacher
That's
for
right.
20 years, I'm going to relate to him quite well. But I think it's a big opportunity, and the momentum was going a different way, but it just shows you if you're a sports, being in the Olympics, anything can happen,
Right.
and this is that game-changing moment. But I think there's a lot of optimism out there.
Your part of Orange County is surrounded by and probably includes some of the most high profile contested. I mean, your the whole county in a way is kind of a quite a contested area for Democrats and Republicans. How do you think that turnout or that enthusiasm might affect some of the races in
I've always been in
Orange County?
a swingy area, which is why you said
Right.
you were here, and actually 2012, and then came back in 2016. It's because I lost a race in
Right.
the swing district. It's now been redistricted, so I do have parts of LA, but it's still very much a snapshot of not only California but America. On my own block, I live in a little 1950s,
Hmm.
the home built in about 1950, so older home. And many of the people on our block are teachers or principals, that type of neighborhood. And we do an annual Christmas ball where everybody makes Christmas balls, hangs
Wow.
them in their trees, and we get hundreds of cars. It's called the Sparkle Ball neighborhood. People have movies on their garages and close off the street. And I guarantee, because I've knocked on the doors, not only in my neighborhood, but surrounding, the party affiliation is completely mixed. Even within the same house, you can have Democrats, you can have Republicans, you can have independents. And yet we find a way to get along, neighbor to
Hmm.
neighbor. To recently, it might be a little gossipy, but somebody's dog got out and then went after another dog. So this was lots of discussion. But what I'm saying is, we're not all the same party, we're not all the same affiliation, different ages. There's a lot of babies being born on the block now. My kids are growing. But I think as a country, we have to figure out how to get back to communicating, how to get back to, I don't necessarily agree with you on that issue, but I still like you. We've lost that, what we used to say, compromise. And when I was on council way back from 2004 to 2012, 8 years, I was never in the majority. I'm in the
Right.
majority up here, but I wasn't there. So I had to figure out how to work with my colleagues. And matter of fact, you mentioned that I was named mayor. I was named mayor by a third vote by a Republican young guy who is now a judge, Sean Nelson. And he and I will both say we got along fine. He had 3
Right.
kids. I had 4 at that time. And we didn't agree on everything, but we figured out, okay, what can we agree on? what are the things that we have that are, we agree on safe neighborhoods, we agree on public safety, we agree on good libraries, we agree on good sports fields.
Right.
And these are the type of things that we've gotten so far away. And it's either I love this person or I hate that person. And, but I do think that you're right. They are battleground seats in some areas of Orange County. The congressional seat will be a huge
Right.
seat, and they're going to have to be hard fought. What I really hope, and it doesn't matter if it's city council, congressional, presidential, is that people value our system of democracy and we stop this. Well, it was fraud, because this story and narrative have been going on for so many years now that it's a really dangerous place to be in.
Yeah, the polarization you're talking about, it's something which we see a lot, and yeah, and I know, um, yeah, I mean, because obviously our organization, our membership actually tends to be, in general, regardless of their party affiliation, lean toward a more moderate temperament, and I think that's the nature of what they do. They're realtors; they want to make a deal, right? You can't make
Exactly.
a deal if you're both adamant about your position on what this house looks like or what the kitchen should be. You're trying to reach a deal. You want to make things happen, and that's done by compromising and working things out. So I think our membership is especially sensitive to that polarization and the detriments of that, and a lot of concern. Um, and you've probably heard it too. I mean, sometimes in our government affairs department, we'll get calls just because something popped up on a social media feed, and like, I can't believe Sacramento's doing that. It's like, well, they're not actually, and so it's yeah, this is something
There's been some
which
bills actually,
yeah,
in housing, and I remember it was one was about applications for rentals, and it was that we're going to let a bunch of convicts.
hmm
And I remember having some of the constituents call, and I said, that's not what the bill does. We got to read
right,
it. So again, it goes back to that education, because with social media, it's so easy to put a post up,
right,
and then it's the truth. And it will continue to be that way with AI. Even now, you'll see photos and you're like, that is not, that doesn't look right.
right.
But unless you have a magnifying glass, it's going to be more and more difficult to know and what's really true and what's not true. And we have less people reading newspapers or
Right.
journalistic background where you have to verify. So it'll continue to be fuzzy, but it is incumbent upon leaders, elected leaders, organizations to, like you say, how do we work towards the center?
Right.
How do we find areas that are going to be good for our communities? And that's what housing is about.
Yeah, we couldn't agree more on that. We
Mm,
gotta try to meet and
yeah.
compromise and work things out. Before we conclude, what are some of the best ways? As you know, realtors tend to be very involved in their communities, um, and uh, in political issues. How are good ways to convey their concerns, interests to elected officials such as yourself?
Well, whether it's local, and I always go back to my local days as a city council member, or state, it's always that very basic reaching out, the face to face. Hey, can we get a meeting early? So whether you're looking at the legislative calendar or a council, sometimes you'll have people show up the night of the agenda item, but backing up 2 or 3 meetings, or 2 or 3 months, I mean, to saying, hey, can we sit down with you? We want to show you this information, and doing it more than once, because I've often seen that sometimes, even up in Sacramento, and we have a big third house up here,
Right.
I'll get a text message at the moment the bill is going through on the floor.
Right. Right.
And I not going to name names, but I sometimes think like, this was presented in January. We're now in May,
Right.
or sometimes it's the night before. So really, for having advocates And realtors, if they're trying to get something moved forward in their own city or even up here, it's the early and often advice and face to face when possible. Text message should definitely be secondary to getting your viewpoint. And I know I have a whole team up here and down there. We all do. I try to tell them a text message is not a thank you note.
Right.
Pick up the phone and call. And again, some of these things seem a little old, but they're important.
Yeah, thank you. That helps. Our membership still does a very much, the nature of their work tends to be very face to face, but it's something I always have to remind lots of people, including just people I know as friends, that this is a business which is meaning politics and is still one which is face to face. It's not because so many areas now everything's just video or, as you mentioned, texting or messaging or email, but not that much in person. But this is still very much an in person
And seeing the patterns
business.
of people, because you can send out an email or a social media. Is anybody really opening it? I know we used to work quite a lot, like on a newsletter.
Right.
And then my communication person is here, and we looked at the analytics on it, and it's like, for the time we spent putting it together for the opening, is that as valuable as maybe more short, smaller communications on a
Right.
weekly base than one big newsletter that maybe somebody opens the first page and they're not opening the last 3 pages of it.
Right.
So really understanding that people have a snapshot of time, but that those calls, because even if the elected can't meet with you, I'm assuming somebody's giving them the information and they're noting it.
Right.
And but again, doing it multiple times, because maybe the first time they couldn't get it on the schedule, but 2 weeks later, hey, I know you weren't available. Can we try to get something together now?
Okay, great. That's very helpful.
Mhm.
And if you do get, as a result of this
Yeah.
advice, realtors calling you multiple times,
Yeah.
All right.
And I do. We have some that I've known for years in Fullerton. And again, at the point where you know them so well, you don't mind a text.
Right.
But that's because we've, sat down, had lunch, whatever. And so those are really important relationships.
All right. Terrific. Thank you so much for sharing your
Yeah.
insights and expertise. Any last words for us?
I just happy to be here. Really appreciate what the realtors are doing. And that's not only housing people, but the California dream.
Thank you so much. We greatly appreciated your time and thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Disclaimer. The purpose of this podcast, brought to you by the California Association of Realtors, C.A.R., is to provide general and educational information and opinions from a wide range of perspectives regarding politics, voting, elections, legislative issues, and more. The opinions, beliefs, and views expressed by guests or participants of this podcast are solely their own and do not necessarily reflect the opinions, beliefs, or views of C.A.R., its affiliates, their respective directors, officers, or employees. Reference to any individual or entity does not constitute an endorsement, recommendation, or any other position or opinion regarding that entity or individual by C.A.R. This podcast does not constitute professional advice or services of any kind. This podcast is available for private, non-commercial use only. You may not edit, modify, or redistribute this podcast.